Hello, my name is David Seljak, and I am the coordinator of the St. Jerome's Lectures in Catholic Experience. Welcome. And welcome to the 2021-22 series. And I would like to, in fact, begin today's event by respectfully acknowledging that St. Jerome's University and the University of Waterloo are on the traditional territory of the neutral Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee peoples. We are, in fact, situated on the Haldimand Tract, the land promised to 6 nations that includes 6 miles on each side of the Grand River. This is the third event in our this year's lecture series, a presentation by Dr. Melissa Nelson entitled Restoring the Medicine Line as Indigenous Land Guardianship. The theme of the 2021-2022 Lectures in Catholic Experience is fog and light. The truth, like the future, is often obscured from our vision. Admitting that his knowledge, like his prophecy, was imperfect, St. Paul said, "For now we see in a mirror dimly, but then face to face. Now I know in part, then I shall understand fully, even as I have been fully understood." He might have said that we glimpse the truth only through a fog. Moreover, in our day, a fog of information, misinformation, and disinformation complicates public debates around politics, growing socioeconomic inequality, climate change, issues of racism, indigenization and reconciliation, as well as old prejudices around ethnicity, religion, sexual orientation, and identity. For this year's lectures, we have asked our speakers to help us find light in these uncertain and difficult times. Tonight, we will address 2 timely and urgent issues around which there is too much heat and too little light. In the last 6 or 7 years, Canadians have begun to address our sorry history of colonization and injustice towards Indigenous peoples in Canada. In this effort, Canadians are beginning to see the extent and nature of the harm done in the building of this society we call Canada, a project that began with and depended upon the dispossession and marginalization of Indigenous people. Building a prosperous and affluent society also required exploitation of what we call the environment, the non-human world upon which our entire way of life depends. Increasingly, we have become aware of the fact that this way of life is unsustainable. To help us find some light, we welcome tonight Professor Melissa Nelson of the University of Arizona, where she serves as professor in the School of Sustainability in the College of Global Futures, and Senior Global Futures Scientist in the Julianne Wrigley Global Futures Laboratory. An Indigenous ecologist, writer, editor, media maker, and scholar activist, Professor Nelson has previously served as Professor of American Indian Studies at San Francisco State University, where she specialized in Indigenous environmental and California Indian studies. Tonight, Professor Nelson will examine the important political, cultural, and spiritual work of First Nation groups in Canada and the United States who reclaim ancestral lands as well as their traditional roles as land guardians. She argues that at this time of profound climate disruption, First Nation peoples are asserting and renewing their sacred relationship with their other than human kin, such as totem animals, as well as elements such as water and fire. This reclaiming and revitalization of land guardianship roles and practices is, she says, often characterized as protecting the medicines of the land so they may continue to give life to all of creation. Besides numerous book chapters and journal articles, Professor Nelson is the author of Original Instructions, Indigenous Teachings for a Sustainable Future, and co-editor of Traditional Ecological Knowledge, Learning from Indigenous Practices for Environmental Sustainability, published by Cambridge University Press. Her latest project is a co-edited volume called What Kind of Ancestor Do You Want to Be?, published last May by the University of Chicago Press. Professor Nelson is Anishinaabe, Cree, Métis, and Norwegian, a proud member of the Turtle Mountain Band of Chippewa Indians. She is a transdisciplinary and community-based scholar dedicated to Indigenous rights and sustainabilities, biocultural heritage, and environmental justice, as well as the revitalization of community health and cultural arts. In her work in higher education, as well as in the community, she advocates for the rights of Indigenous peoples and sustainability. Her work focuses particularly on Indigenous food sovereignty at the local, regional, and global levels. I hope you will help me in joining digitally and virtually to the St. Jerome's, our guest tonight, Professor Melissa Nelson.
Oh, Chimigwich. Wow, thank you, David. That was a little over the top, but thank you. It is really my honor to be here with you all today, and thank you to the lecture series and St. Jerome's University for this kind invitation. It would have been nice to be with you in person, and hopefully that will happen again sometime in the future. I am calling in today from the sovereign lands of the Coast Miwok Nation, also known as the Federated Indians of Great Rancheria, on the northern shore of the San Francisco Bay Area in Northern California, adjacent to Ohlone lands. And it is really my honor to speak to you today from these lands as a guest and visitor on Coast Miwok lands in Mount Tamalpais, the West Mountain, one of the sacred mountains of this region. And I'll now introduce myself more traditionally. Bujun and Dinue Maganatug. I greet you all as relatives. Happy to be with you tonight. Melissa Nelson is my name. Makunzi Gabawik, Yidashin Indigo. Makunzi Gabawik is my Ojibwe name, a young bear woman standing in the morning. And I am Nin Anishinabe Ikwe, an Anishinaabe woman, Piju Dodame, a member of the Lynx clan. And I am a proud member of the Turtle Mountain Anishinaabe Nation, or Chippewa Nation, based in North Dakota. And it is really my honor to be here with you today. Miigwech, thank you. I will dive into my lecture presentation with a PowerPoint. So let me pull that up. And I look forward to any questions or comments throughout the lecture, and David will be facilitating at the end. All right. How does that look? Good? All right, so restoring the medicine line as Indigenous land guardianship. And David gave a great introduction to kind of my core arguments and themes. This is still a work in progress. It's an inquiry, a deep inquiry into some of these concepts and some of these movements happening in Native America, North America, both Canada and the United States. And really, it's a global movement of native land guarding. So just a little bit more about my positionality, but I think David's introduction covered most of this. So I would say the only thing I want to add here is that I'm engaged in urban intertribal work as well as rural land-based work. So urban intertribal communities in the San Francisco Bay Area and the Phoenix Valley of Arizona, where they're very vibrant urban Indigenous communities, much like Ottawa or Vancouver or Winnipeg, many of the Canadian cities. Again, I've always looked at the intersections of science and the humanities, ecology, and Indigenous studies. I consider myself a scholar activist, very honored to work in higher education, in the nonprofit sector, and also in the philanthropic sector. I see that as a form of voluntary reparations, in a way, returning resources to First Nations and Indigenous communities. And a lot of my work has been done through a Native-led nonprofit organization, the Cultural Conservancy. You can check out more about our work at nativeland.org, where I still serve as board president and served as the CEO for a couple of decades. So that's where I've done a lot of my community-based work in conjunction with my academic research. And today we're going to talk about the medicine line. And this is a very beautiful, complex concept that is geographic, political, cultural, spiritual, and for our people, the Turtle Mountain Band of Chippewa Indians, it is a very personal concept because this line crossed our people. And the medicine line is a boundary. It's a dotted line, but it can also be an edge that cuts both ways. It is a political division between these two nation states, US and Canada. There's friction there always between jurisdictions and laws and nations. But it is a defining line that Indigenous peoples are refusing and reclaiming in very complex and beautiful ways. So my chapter that is exploring this in this talk is really an inquiry into the medicine line, literally and metaphorically. And just to give you an idea, it's along the 49th parallel here, particularly between the Lake of the Woods area of Ontario and Point Roberts over in BC and Washington in the Salish Sea, where the Puget Sound. And if you look at this land base at Turtle Mountain in North Dakota and Manitoba, you see there is no line there, right? This medicine line actually cuts right through our beautiful sacred mountain area where our people have been for a couple of hundred years, or many bands much, much longer than that, depending if you are Cree or Saulteaux or Métis French from the north. It came down, or if you were Ojibwe from the Great Lakes that came west, or even some of the Nakota Cree folks who came from the other direction. But you'll see that the Turtle Mountain area is a beautiful unified mountain range that just rises like a turtle out of the great northern plains. And yet this medicine line bisects it, cuts right through it, with half of it, or a little over half, as you can see here on the south side, and a little under half on the northern Canadian side. And so this is a line that has been very much contested historically by our people and our relatives who live on both sides of this line, Ojibwe, Cree, Métis people. And really, it's part of the birthplace of the Métis Nation. We know really the Red River Valley is considered kind of the sacred origins of the Métis people, contested also with many other, definitions and sources. But this is really where the French fur trade and my ancestors and many of our ancestors met at Fort Garry and Pembina and many of the different areas, Lake of the Woods, and really created this new nation. So for us, the medicine line and the Turtle Mountain area is very much this ethnogenesis, this area of the creation of this combined people of generally French, Chippewa Cree folks. And here on the left, it's a beautiful illustration of the buffalo. We are buffalo people. And historically, when Ojibwe people were moved from the Great Lakes into the Great Plains, we learned more of the Plains tradition and really honoring the buffalo in a very deep way, and following the buffalo across the medicine line before it was a political boundary. So throughout this whole area that's today considered, Manitoba, Saskatchewan, Montana, North Dakota, Minnesota, where the buffalo once really ruled the land and tended to the ecosystems of that land, and our people worked with and followed the buffalo in a very intimate reciprocal relationship. And today, the Buffalo Treaty, an incredible new treaty that was created in 2014 and signed by dozens and dozens of First Nations and Native American tribes on both sides of the medicine line, are really reclaiming this area as a unified Indigenous area. On the right here, you see the famous Peace Gardens, which is a site really 5 miles from our reservation homeland in North Dakota, in Dunseith, North Dakota, where it's supposed to be dedicated to the peace between our nations and between tribes. But I think there needs to be kind of a restoring and a re-envisioning of what this Peace Garden really means in the era of reconciliation. And so the Indigenous land guardianship movement, of course, has always been underway. Our people have always been concerned about protecting and restoring the sanctity of our traditional lands, our sacred sites, our gathering sites, our hunting grounds, our fishing grounds, since the time the first colonists stepped foot in Canada and the US. However, due to all the decades and centuries of colonialism, we were very much contained on our reserves and reservations, always with people in urban areas, but really having to do some stealth hiding out and to access our lands, and sometimes, assert our treaty rights and violate, quote, private property rights to be able to tend to and access our traditional territories. Thankfully, since the era of more interest in Indigenous peoples and the era of reconciliation in Canada, there's been more of a public discourse about Indigenous land rights and the need for Native peoples to, again, reclaim and reassert and get recognized for the work of guardianship that they've always been doing secretly and quietly and privately. So the Indigenous Guardians help Indigenous nations honor the cultural responsibility to care for lands and waters. They serve as the eyes and ears of our traditional territories. This is a direct quote from the Indigenous Leadership Initiative that you can find out more about at this website. And this is a very old and important concept to many Indigenous peoples. I've been fortunate to work with some of the Maori people of Aotearoa in New Zealand, where the concept of guardianship is very much at the forefront of their philosophy, of their nations, their communities, and their relationships to land. And all the different Indigenous peoples of the world have various concepts of guarding, caretaking, relationship building, and also this concept that Indigenous peoples have treaties with our kin. So this bear and this fish, we have treaties with them to protect and care for them. And those treaties with creation were sadly, devastatingly divided and broken and ruptured by the various waves of colonialism. The classic with the fur trade and our relationship to the beaver and the other furred animals. And now up with the salmon in the Pacific Northwest, there are such grave concerns about the health and well-being of the salmon, again, due to external exploitation, not First Nations exploitation or harvesting of that relative. So for us, it is a deep spiritual violation to see our relatives be overexploited and to be harmed. And so the Indigenous land guardianship movement is an act to really reclaim that tradition and to assert those rights on our ancestral territories, whether we get, quote, permission for that or not. Fortunately, in Canada, the nation state has recognized Indigenous land guardianship and is securing resources and supporting networks and training and equipment. Very exciting to see that happening in the Canadian context. In the United States, however, everyone is still doing it quite on a grassroots level, really at a community level. There's not a lot of national attention to it yet, but we're hopeful with Deb Haaland, our first Secretary of Interior, the first Native American woman to serve in a major political position, that really works to take care of our lands. And here in the US, especially in California, but throughout the United States, we often, rather than refer to land guardianship, we refer to land rematriation. And this really came out of the repatriation movement, the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, that was used to protect and repatriate, return ancestors, sacred objects, objects of cultural patrimony from museums and universities back to their homelands. And so rematriation is really returning land back to Mother Earth and returning to really sacred feminine values to nurture relationships. And according to the Land Back Manifesto of the Indian Collective, they say that land back is really about the relationship with Mother Earth that is symbiotic and just, where we have reclaimed our stewardship. So very similar to the philosophy of land guardianship in Canada, with just a slight variation. Also, an organization I work closely with, the Saguarote Land Trust, talk about rematriation as the ability to restore a people to their rightful place in sacred relationship with their ancestral land. So again, for Indigenous peoples, when we talk about land, yes, it's territory, it's politics, it's sovereignty, it's food sovereignty, and it's deeply tied to our spiritual well-being. So again, the ability to go out to our landscapes, our ancestral lands, whether they are forests or plains or lakes or creeks or deserts or mountaintops, to be able to go out and reconnect with mashkiki, the Ojibwe word for the medicine of the land or the strength of the land. It not only supports our physical strength and sustenance, but our emotional, spiritual, and mental well-being when we can restore or restory that relationship with those ancestral homelands. And many scholars have written about, you know, the disease of dislocation, what happens when we have been dislocated from our traditional lands, and then the great healing that can happen when we are reunified with those traditional lands and the plants and animals and spirits that dwell within them. So we know there's a great need for restoration. And as an ecologist, this is a term that we use a lot, and I just want to define it in a few different ways for you. So we talk a lot about ecosystem restoration, which is simply the process of assisting the recovery of an ecosystem that has been degraded, damaged, or destroyed. Very simply put by the Society for Ecological Restoration. You restore a damaged ecosystem. Now, what that looks like is going to depend and be very different. We don't have time to go into that, but it's a very important process, and many settlers are interested in ecosystem restoration. It's kind of ironic that many scientists are interested in restoring the native habitats and biodiversity, but not necessarily the cultural diversity and the cultural heritage of these places. So there have been many of us that have been working for a couple of decades on extending the concept of ecosystem restoration to biocultural restoration. So really restoring the ecological values as well as the cultural values of a place that's connected really to the concept of placemaking. So biocultural restoration is the science and practice of restoring not only ecosystems, but human and cultural relationships to place, so that cultures are strengthened and revitalized along with the lands to which they are inextricably linked. And that comes from the Center for Native Peoples and the Environment at SUNY Syracuse, just across the way from you. And then Robin Kimmerer really extends that definition even further to really challenge people doing restoration work to do reciprocal restoration, which is the mutually reinforcing restoration of land and culture, such that the repair of ecosystem services contributes to cultural revitalization, and renewal of culture promotes the restoration of ecological integrity. So again, it's fundamental to this concept of reciprocity that goes back to our original instructions to tend to those treaties with creation. As the land feeds us, gives us fresh water, gives us food, gives us shelter, we must again tend to these land animals and critters and all the different relatives. And it's not just metaphorical, it's quite literal for us. And just some examples of some of the land tending that is going on. You know, traditional land guardians throughout Turtle Island are working to restore the plants and the animals and the seeds. Here's a couple of examples of an elder working with Thule plants, very important plant, used for everything from beds to boats to toys. You can make anything with Thule. It's a wonderful plant, very generous plant. It's also a food source. You can eat the seeds and the roots. On the right, here are some youth working with seeds and gathering seeds for agriculture and for sharing them and trading them through traditional trade networks across the medicine line. So the restoration of the lands has been going on for a long time, but we need to accelerate it given the damage that has been done to our ecosystems and the acceleration of climate change and climate chaos that is wreaking a lot of havoc in our homelands and territories. But we know equally important as restoring the biodiversity of the land and the cultural diversity of the land is restoring the land. We live in storied landscapes, or what are sometimes called storyscapes. And here we see a beautiful traditional painting by Rabbit Strickland, the famous Ojibwe artist who has given me permission to use some of his artwork, like this beautiful image of our ancestors, Anishinabe and the Jiman, the birch bark canoe, traveling with turtle. And these are all tied to our traditional stories, so that when we gather wigwas or anything, there are stories tied to when to gather it, how to gather it, why we gather it, how to take care of the forest, how to take care of the birch bark so that it continued to give us everything also from baskets and boats, just like the Thule for many other tribes. And here on the left, we have a beautiful painting by Elle Manriquez, the wonderful California Indian artist and self-proclaimed decolonizationist, who is talking about coyote lighting up the stars with the sun. And so every time we look at the stars or the sun or birch bark, there are storied landscapes and storyscapes that also remind us of moral behavior and ethical behavior, how to act around these relatives, what Enrique Somon would call moral landscapes. We live in moral landscapes that are constantly reminding us through our stories how to be a better human being and how to take care of each other. And also I get the same concept from Pacific Island relatives and colleagues and friends. The Ratuman people of the Fijian Islands, they have a concept that the land has eyes. The land sees everything you do, and you have a moral obligation to be a good person because the land is watching you. The land has eyes, and also the land has teeth, meaning if you violate those natural laws, there will be consequences. So we have to constantly remember the stories of the land and create new stories for the land, because we are co-creating with the spirit of Mother Earth and the universe with every breath. So restoring is really an act of receiving the stories from our elders, from our oral traditions, from those incredible lineages of songs and chants and dances, that talk about the landscape, but equally we are also honoring the land by giving back to it with carving symbols into cedar trees or carving messages and maps onto art with rocks and baskets and paintings on our birch bark. So this is a way that we restore the landscape with reciprocal restoration as Indigenous peoples that brings together again the sciences and the humanities. Land guardianship in Canada has really exploded as a movement, and there are so many different elements to it that's just fantastic. I'm just trying to keep up with researching it all for this chapter, which I think will now turn into a full-fledged book project. But the land guardianship in Canada, this is a beautiful Nuu-chah-nulth territory up in Tofino area, one of the first tribal parks in the world. So the tribal park movement has just been wonderfully taking off with Native people reclaiming their sovereignty to certain areas and setting them up as tribal parks for traditional activities, but also for ecotourism and sustainable economic development. There's the concept of Indigenous protected and conserved areas. It is really catching fire around the world for Indigenous peoples to use this concept to protect their lands for their own purposes. There's the whole conservation through reconciliation movement in Canada with support to set up reconciliation innovation centers. The first one will be set up in Tofino in the Nuu-chah-nulth Tribal Park, which should be very, very exciting, the work of Isaac Alum, which I'll mention a little later. There's a whole Indigenous guardianship network and training program with associated GIS mapping in every province in Canada, with elders teaching young folks how to, again, be guardians of the lands and waters, to tend to our relatives in the best way possible so that our future generations will be able to drink clean water and have healthy food to gather. There's also major political resistance happening because we know there are still violations of our traditional homelands, our sacred sites, with the oil industry and pipes and canals and extraction and timber cutting. And so one example, the tiny house warriors in Canada, a group of women just put up their tiny homes, said, you will not go through our traditional lands. This is our sovereign land. So you have to take a stand and guard your land, sometimes, you know, many times against the police authorities. So it is very political, our land guardianship work, as well as very spiritual. And we have to traverse all this different territory, much like the metaphor of the medicine line, where it can be a sharp division that really divides us, but it also can be a fluid boundary that helps us, where we can use it to protect us. So land guardianship is a very significant instruction that we need to tend to, that's happening in a really significant way in Canada and in the United States. Land rematriation in what we call Indian country in the United States. We know there are over 500 sovereign nations in the lower 48 states. There are many unrecognized nations as well, like in Canada, of estimated 200 to 300 different tribes that have no tribal lands whatsoever and are invisible, have suffered from the politics of erasure, and really are in need of recognition and land guardianship. There are certain entities, though, a lot of intertribal entities, such as the Intertribal Sinkyone Council, the first native land trust in the United States, going back to the early 80s, that is creating a new model of land rematriation and land guardianship, using native-led nonprofit organizations, creating native land trusts, working with conservation organizations, big ones like the Nature Conservancy and small local ones, to create partnerships and for protection and tending to and harvesting of tribal resources. There are also private land holdings and private landowners that are finally recognizing, wow, I think I find arrowheads in my backyard all the time. This must be an archaeological site. This must have been a village site for Native peoples. Maybe I can work with the local tribe and return it, rematriate it to them through something called a conservation easement. There's also a big movement with organic and regenerative farms as they realize the racial inequity that has been happening for centuries, and the amount of land holdings that a lot of large farmers and small farmers have. They're starting to open up their lands to create agreements so that Indigenous peoples can either farm if they were farmers, or at least restore some of their traditional territories on these farms. And then there's always parks co-management, which is usually not an equal kind of 50-50 arrangement, but at least Indigenous communities and tribes have some level of access to their traditional resources and lands on Park Service land. That's another tool that is often used in the United States and in Canada. The Saguarote Land Trust, I mentioned earlier, is the first urban Indigenous women-led land trust that facilitates the return of Indigenous land to Indigenous people. I'm very proud to be part of the founding board of directors, all Indigenous women, many scholars and activists and organizers and leaders. It is located the homelands of the Lisjan Ohlone people, also known as Oakland, California. And our purpose is to cultivate rematriation. Saguarote calls on all of us to heal and transform the legacies of colonization, genocide, and patriarchy, and to do the work our ancestors and future generations are calling us to do. So again, a slightly different interpretation, but a very parallel and similar goal as the Land Guardianship Initiative in Canada. One of the great tools of the Saguarote Land Trust that I thought was just so brilliant is something called the Shu'umi tax. And the Shu'umi land tax is an invitation to support and donate financially to the Saguarote Land Trust. It's like a voluntary tax. So if you've lived in their traditional territories for 5 years, 50 years, 3-4 generations, and realize that you never paid $1 of taxes or recognition to the first peoples of the land who took care of the land for at least 10,000 years. You have the opportunity to contribute back as a form of reconciliation and reparations to donate back to the Indigenous people. The Ohlone people have no federal sovereign status, no recognition by the US government as a sovereign nation. So they work as a Native-led nonprofit organization. And it's been incredible to see the generosity and the healing and the goodwill that has happened by common citizens and settler communities who have donated money, houses, cars, tools, resources back to the first people, the Lisjan Ohlone landscape, and the Ohlone descendants and their future generations. So a really exciting model of kind of voluntary reparations, and that's happening at a grassroots level throughout the United States. And as another key example of an organization in Canada that is really leading this work is the Isaac Olam Foundation outside of BC, Canada, and led by Eli Enns, a very dynamic Nuu-chah-nulth leader, and a group of folks from that area. And the Isaac Olam really combines two traditional concepts, really spiritual or religious concepts. Isak, it is the highest law in the Nuu-chah-nulth constitution. It is represented by the sun, moon crest at the top of their totem poles. And it's really about our unity with the land and our responsibilities to the land. Olam, as many of you may know better than me, is a Hebrew phrase meaning to repair and to heal and to perfect the world. So I love that even in the foundation's title, they are bringing together two different traditions as a form of reconciliation and as a form of repair and healing. And you can find out more information about Isak Olam at this website. And I think this is just such a fundamental belief here and value that reconciliation between Crown and Indigenous societies cannot happen until there is reconciliation with the land. And I remember hearing the great leader of the Onondaga talk about how there will be no peace among nations until we stop the war on Mother Earth. And that's really said, a very similar sentiment said in a different way by the great Peace Chief Oren Lyons from the Onondaga, the faith keeper. And how do we make peace with the land and reconciliation with the land and with each other is a very much the challenge of our times, I would say. And here is a wonderful elder from the New Chenolth people who is working to restore and keep alive the salmon harvesting and cooking traditions and the stories of how to relate with the salmon. Such an important way of working with the land and the animals of the land. He's also a great canoe builder and really wonderful storyteller. So this is an example of someone working within a tribal park and restoring and maintaining and keeping alive that relationship. I think it's very important too that we reconnect with all of the elements, the land, the water, the fire, and the air. And given climate change and the devastating fires that have been impacting Turtle Island these last 5 years, I live in California where we have just had horrific fires, but I know BC and the Arctic has burned and so many places, Alberta, have had inland BC, just horrific fires. And clearly from a traditional knowledge perspective, we have become gravely out of balance with fire. And yet fire, we know, is a medicine and is a sacred element. And yet we're completely out of balance with fire because it's showing up in such a devastating way. And it's also showing the lack of land guardianship that has been happening for centuries that has allowed this level of fuel buildup and really has been one of the key factors in causing the devastating fires. So we need to restore our relationship to fire with our oral traditions, our land care methods, to heal the land, to prevent catastrophic fire, and honor the sacred connection to this core element. Here are photos from a land base that I co-manage, Heron Shadow, through the Cultural Conservancy in Coast Miwok Territory. And a year ago, December, we were able to do a cultural burn with the guidance of elders to really clean the land and to bring back some of the dormant seeds that were hiding within the land and needed fire to help with that regenerative process. So fire is really key, not only for land care, but we know for our ceremonies. And this is another land base, a living cultural heritage area, a land rematriation site that is used for ceremonial purposes for urban Indian communities in San Francisco and Oakland on Ohlone lands, a place called Indian Canyon, where we can gather together traditionally, because many people cannot even gather and have a fire to honor a deceased loved one or to celebrate a birth. And that's really key to our, again, sense of our spiritual well-being. And again, just another example of the importance of fire and the beauty of fire and the mystery of fire. And again, getting back to our medicine line on the prairie, our word for fire and our word for prairie and the Anishinabe Moen are very closely connected because we used to burn the prairie. That was a regular practice. So I think restoring the relationship to fire is going to be key to the health and future of our Indigenous land guardianship work. So getting close to conclusion here, I would like to just say that we need to restore the medicine line. I want to personally re-envision fire and buffalo in the Turtle Mountain area of the medicine line. Buffalo used to roam all through that area. I'd love to help bring back the buffalo, and I know a lot of our people want to do that as well. We also need to bring back fire and restore that relationship with fire for the health of our prairies and our hillsides. It would be great to train more Indigenous land guardians and do that at the tribal college and through some of the other educational institutions, as well as through the First Nations and Métis networks. I think it's very important that we restore tribal sovereignty, especially of our most important cultural sites that may be endangered by various impacts. We really need to restore mashkiki, our medicines of the land, our teas, and all the different types of medicines that grow along the medicine line, that many of them have been damaged through really the border and the boundary issues. It's time to tell the hidden stories of our Anishinabe, Cree, Nakota, Métis, all the peoples who've lived and traveled across the medicine line, and see that medicine line both for our resistance and our survivance, even historically and to this day. And I think one of my visions, along with Isak Olam and the Métis Federation of Manitoba, is really to work to kind of re-envision the peace gardens on the medicine line with greater First Nations Métis visions and leadership there. I think that could be a wonderful opportunity to work together and again embody reconciliation and conservation. So thank you so much for listening. Chi Miigwech, it's been my honor to share with you some ideas about restoring the medicine line and land guardianship. And I just wanted to end with also an image of my mother, who is really reaching the end of her life. She was born and raised on the Turtle Mountain Chippewa Reservation and speaks Michif, and has really been the source of so much inspiration for me. So if you have any other comments or questions or want to join these recommendations I have in the last slide, please join me at that email or follow me on Twitter, and let's continue to restore the land and support Indigenous land guardianship. Chi Miigwech.
And thank you. My goodness, what a rich and exciting talk. I really am. I was captivated from beginning to end. So, but before we get too much into that, let's open the floor to questions from our attendees. You can post your question at any time in the chat or the Q&A button, which you will find to the left of the leave button. And please do send questions in, and I will ask them as time permits. We actually have a question that was sent during your talk, because you mentioned urban-based Indigenous people. And so the question is, how may urban-based Indigenous people participate in land guardianship?
Great question. Thank you for asking that. And, it's very much size matters, but it's very much a Western colonial concept to think always that bigger is better. And for us, it's really about connecting to even a small little urban park or somebody's backyard, or even a little balcony where you can grow some of your, native seeds and teas. So I work with a very densely populated Native community in the San Francisco, Oakland, Bay Area, where land is so expensive, only billionaires can afford it. You know, all of the Facebook people and, you know, all the media people. So we have to be very stealth. We do what we call a lot of guerrilla gardening, which is finding little land bases in urban areas that usually around parks or sometimes empty lots. And you start to restore that land and restory that land with urban gardens, community gardening, rooftop gardening. There's historic sites in urban areas that have been built over that you can still go to and pray to those ancestors there. Sadly, there are many burial sites that are under parking lots and buildings, but then there's been historic buildings, whether they're churches or missions, that were very important historic sites to Native people, often in a brutal way, but it's still important to honor the true history and legacy and heritage of those sites. So for the San Francisco, Oakland Bay Area, we literally go and have like round dance circles at parking lots that we know are on top of archaeological sacred sites for the Ohlone people, including the Berkeley Shell Mound, which is one of the last major shell mounds, which is a sacred site. It is a burial site that's under a parking lot, and the Saguarote Land Trust and others are trying to protect it and daylight it, get rid of the concrete so that we can honor it and protect it in the right way. And they want to do a cultural park there. So that's a long-term vision. We've also worked with state parks, what would you call provincial parks, city parks, national parks. We've worked with all kinds of different cultural centers, the backyards of cultural centers. We've carved canoes there. So there's many different ways to get involved. And again, size doesn't matter. It's about really finding some earth that you can pray to, that you can do some citizen science, maybe first observe if it's been contaminated or not, the soil and water, to make sure it's clean and safe land, what to do to restore it and to restore it. Bring the local elders out to talk about the history of that land. There's layers and layers of history in urban areas, as we know, between the first Native people, the next Native peoples, then we had the colonial folks here in the US, or in California it was, the Russians, it was the Spanish, it was the Mexicans, it was the Americans, the French and the British, and but there's many layers, and to try to dig deep enough to always know wherever you go, you're on Native land, even in a major metropolitan area. And Native peoples have become very urban now. We love our city landscapes, and, we know them well. And, to get a tour of urban landscapes, they were places of survival and survivance for our people often. So you can get involved with land guardianship and land protection in urban contexts, and go to urban Indian centers are really great places to support them and donate and contribute to them.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I have a question. It is tied to the kind of diversity that you were just speaking to. So how do various diasporic peoples of color in this land contribute to this sacred endeavor? How do you think this dialogue should continue?
Wonderful questions. Yes. I always say we have to really honor, recognize, and center the first peoples of the land. And so they need to be present. You need to do the outreach. And some are contested areas or neutral areas, like the Anishinaabe, the Great Anishinaabe Confederacy, and the Great Haudenosaunee Confederacy, like where you're located. So you're going to be busy. You've got to kind of reach out to understand those different nations and what their goals are for a particular site. I'll just maybe give one example. My organization, the Cultural Conservancy, is an intertribal organization. So we have Anishinaabe, Yaqui, Cree, Hawaiian, Lakota. We're intertribal, but we're all guests here in San Francisco on Ohlone and Coast Miwok land. So whenever people ask us about land back or land rematriation, we say we have to get permission from the local community. So we need to go and ask them, hey, this group wants to give us back or open up access to a 5-acre farm. Do you want access to this 5-acre farm? Because those are your ancestors. That's where your ancestors are buried. It's not where our ancestors are buried. So do you want access to this 5-acre farm exclusively or with us? And then people are so grateful to be asked and to be honored as the traditional guardians of those territories. And often they'll say, oh yeah, we have great stories about that place. Let's come out and do a site visit. They'll look around and they'll say, we just want to come out for 2 times a year to have ceremony here. The rest of the time, we're not farmers. If you want to farm here, go for it. Do organic farming. Don't poison the land and share your produce with us. And so it's a win-win because they really know the land is being restored and restoried and protected. They have access to it, the seasonal times when they want to come out and have access to it. And they know that Native people are honoring their true sovereignty as the first peoples of the land. And even though we're Native, we're immigrant Native or settler Natives in their territory. So we always look to their guidance. Sometimes, though, they may say, we're too busy, we have our hands full, we trust you, do what you want there. So it's all about asking, and it's about, consent and permission.
Wonderful. This next question is asking for some clarification on the gift of fire, this may sound strange. I'm reading. This may sound strange, for I'm horrified by logging in or fires among old-growth forests. Are old-growth forests on the west coast of Turtle Island sacred, or are they out of balance with the gift of fire's renewal? So I'm guessing that we're trying to get at is that you talked about the fire and its role of renewal, and they're asking about preservation of old growth forests.
Great, excellent question, good. And I just wanted to get back to the previous question asked about diasporic communities. So when we have our prayer circles at a parking lot under a freeway, on top of the sacred shell mound, led by the Ohlone spiritual leaders and elders. We have Buddhists there. We have Eritrean folks from Northern Africa. We have Mayan, Guatemalan people from Central America. We have Tibetan folks from refugee camps in India. And, they are just traditional people are generally so happy to meet the traditional peoples of the land. And then after the Ohlone people and the California Indian people do their prayers and traditions, all people are welcome to step up and chant and sing. The Jewish community, nuns have come out, and I mean, it's truly intertribal, intercultural, and interreligious. But we focus first on the first peoples. So I hope that that's how diasporic communities can be integrated and work to support land rematriation. Yep. So I just didn't want to forget that second part of the question.
Yeah, very good. Actually, I love the Isaac Olam combination. It really illustrates your point very well.
Yes, it's such a great. It's great. And if you haven't had Eli Enns as a lecturer, he's quite a dynamic speaker, who's the head of that. So fire was used in almost every ecosystem, including old growth forests. Now, there's something about cultural burning, and that is you do a slow, cool burn. And that seems like counterintuitive. How can you have a cool burn? But believe me, you can have a cool burn. That photo I showed you of fire, did you notice how low it was? How low to the ground the flames were? And it kind of walks on the land. It walks, it moves at the pace of walking. It's slow, it's low, and it's cool. It's not these massive, devastating fires. So the seasonality, when you burn, is absolutely critical. Usually between rains, you want moisture. You do not want to burn at the end of a drought. That can get away from you, right? And fire's tricky. You got to dance with it. You've got to move with it in a way that you do not let it take over and get out of control, which can happen sometimes. And that would be very devastating in an old growth forest. So I think a lot of the fire use in forests has been minimized, but I know the Yurok and the Karuk people up in Northern California and Southern Oregon, beginning of the temperate rainforest, which is what the person asked about, has been restoring fire in forests to take out some of the dead brush, to remove pests, to replenish the soil, to increase culturally significant plants like hazel that grows stronger and better after a fire, to be used for basket weaving. So there are many benefits to fire, and it was definitely used and is still being used as part of ecoforestry management plans. So it is a gift, but it's a dangerous gift, right? One that you have to handle very carefully and cautiously, and be prepared with fire trucks and water, and it's done very carefully these days. But a lot of the U.S. Forest Service and the Canadian equivalent forestry department is starting to bring back traditional cultural burning to minimize the fuel load and prevent these catastrophic fires from getting out of control. So hopefully that answered their question.
Very nicely, but here's a question from one of my favorite former students at St. Jerome's. Nice to see her back. It says, thank you for a riveting talk. Have you worked with any African indigenous groups, such as the Maasai, doing this kind of work? If so, what are some of the similarities and differences you have noticed between the two groups?
Oh, I wish I could answer you that in a positive way, but you know, I've really been focused on Turtle Island, North America, and the Pacific Island regions, and a bit in Meso and South Latin America. I have not worked as much in Africa. I just feel like there's only so many hours of the day, and I missed my opportunity once to travel to Kenya, and I hope I get to travel there again. I'm an admirer of some of the African traditions that I'm aware of, profound, deep traditional indigenous knowledge systems and practices, pastoralism, use of fire, use of you know, ornamentation and body tattooing and rock art, and so many amazing things, and their linguistic diversity is just extraordinary. But I do not have that much personal experience. Sorry, I can't give you a better answer.
Well, she followed up with another question. Sorry, not a better. What practical things? Don't worry, Dana was like this in my class as well. What practical things can immigrants, people of color, do to aid in this work? Sorry, what practical things may immigrants and people of color do to aid in this work?
Great, thank you. Volunteer.
Talk about it in general, but this is the practical stuff.
Yes, you can volunteer with a local land guardianship network or organization. You can contribute, you know, your time or any resources you want to learning about the local tribal parks or land guardianship efforts, the urban cultural centers. Native communities and organizations and tribes need good support when given humbly and sincerely. There's many different ways to contribute, and just educating yourselves about the true history of the land and indigenous rights that is a first step. That is a really important first step. And really always remembering that Native people are still here. We have really strong traditions, and we have a lot of struggles, and we need good allies. So there's many different ways that you can be a good ally, but it's best to look locally wherever you're based to see what the local people want and need at this time.
Terrific. I have another question here. What is the relationship between Indigenous spirituality and land guardianship? You touched on it, but I think our questioner would like to see the connection made more explicit.
Yes, well, it's really becomes, I guess, more of a metaphysical question. Again, when you look at the epistemology, I got to use some bigger words here, but the worldviews of Indigenous spiritual traditions, we often do not break down this, what we perceive as an artificial boundary between the physical world and the metaphysical world, or matter and spirit, because we believe that all beings, this body right now, this land, is imbued with the sacred source, the spirit, whether we call it whatever we call it. For Ojibwe people, Gitchimanado, the great mystery. So all life is illuminated with this great mystery, which means we must constantly be vigilant to be humble and keep alive our learning spirits, keep listening to the land, keep listening to each other, and keep listening to our inner voice, our intuition, and that connection to what we may call our spirit. And so because our worldviews do not think that matter is devoid of spirit, matter, earth, mother, is truly our mother. It's not just a metaphor. So soil is the flesh of Mother Earth. The rivers are the blood of Mother Earth. The wind is the air, the breath of Mother Earth. And the fire is the spirit of Mother Earth. So those elements for us are not just, neutral, dead, physical processes from kind of a scientific perspective. They're actually imbued with spiritual values. And likewise, the plants and the animals are sentient, have personhood. And they have personality, and they have agency. And so you cannot just, harvest a salmon, as like it's a dead object, or it's just something to be consumed. It is a relative that has its own families and its own life cycle. And we need to honor that whole life cycle when we harvest the salmon or the walleye or whatever it may be. So, the land is also where our ancestors are buried. The bones of our ancestors end up, in the land. And so whenever you're walking on the land, you're walking on somebody's ancestors. And so it's really important to recognize the sacredness of the earth in that way. So for us, land guardianship is imbued with those spiritual values of tending to and caring for the divine, as embodied in a birch bark tree, or a redwood tree, or a pond or a lake or a turtle or a beaver or an eagle. And we also have clan animals. As Ojibwe people, we come from and are related to, I said I'm related to the lynx. I'm also related to the bear through my name. I'm also related to the turtle through my place of ancestral origin. So those animals are our teachers. And I think it's really what a lot of modern science is kind of understanding, is that nature has an intelligence way beyond what we ever imagined, the intelligence of trees. So Indigenous worldviews understand that the land is our teacher, and the land is our mother, and the land is our source of spiritual values, as well as the stars. It's not just the earth, because the earth is connected to the stars and the universe, the whole enchilada. So everything is connected. So for us, tending to the land is really tending to creation.
Right. I have actually, somebody popped in a comment here, which is simply to say that Hinduism regards them as the 5 sacred elements too, and noted a lot of similarities there.
That's right. Thank you.
In your talk, you mentioned original instructions, which is the title of one of your book. What are these instructions, and who gave them?
So again, I honor the diversity of each culture and each traditional community and each language, because every language is different. The grammar and vocabulary are different. And so there's going to be great variation. There's no really universal original instructions. That's why it's instructions plural. Every community is going to have slightly different ones. But I could just say our Anishinaabe, we have our 7 grandfathers, our 7 ancestors' teachings, humility, honesty, bravery, courage, generosity, love. So our original instructions are generally those teachings that were given to us in our creation stories by our creator, or the sons or daughters of our creator. For the Haudenosaunee, it's Sky Woman, falls from the sky and lands on Turtle's back and brings the sacred seeds and shares about the role of dancing and reciprocity and prayer and gratitude. And for us, we have a similar story with our Turtle Island, the origin story, and Nana Buju, our trickster, who came out and gave the teachings to the people, but learned how to respect that covenant with the animals and how important it was to respect those treaties with creation. So, some people may even liken them to, the many different world religions have these kind of sacred teachings and original instructions about being a good person, being a moral person, a humble person, a generous person, a forgiving person. So when you get down to it, it's very similar to other world religions, but each tribe will have a slight variation based on their own language, their own worldview, their own creation stories.
Okay, thank you. Yes, I have to read through commentary before I get to the question. Only because honestly, we've done this a number of times, and we're getting a lot of positive feedback in the question period. So people are sending comments rather than questions, but they're simply very excited by your presentation so far. In fact, it's a little more over the top than that. I have this question is, how do you keep anger at bay with regards to the deep injustice Indigenous people face and continue to face in their displacement that you mentioned?
I love these questions. Wow. It is sometimes a struggle. It is sometimes a struggle for sure. I think sometimes you have to get angry. I do believe there is time for a righteous anger, and that you have to express your emotions. I think fire, is another teacher of anger, right? I mean, you have to explode, right? Or some things are incendiary. And, there's a purpose to anger. We don't want it to get destructive or dangerous, but I think there is a form of righteous anger or sacred anger at the injustices. I mean, what fueled, Martin Luther King and many of the great leaders? It's a certain outrage. I guess I feel more outrage at injustice, and then I turn that outrage into a solution or an intervention, a way to do something positive. And I think that, fuel or transform that anger into something proactive. Even, protesting is a great way to release that. And, I believe in nonviolent protest and civil disobedience, like the tiny house warriors and others who have, sadly been getting arrested for just protecting their lands. It's so unjust. And those injustices will continue. And that's why, as an activist, we often call it the struggle. It seems like the struggle will never end because injustices seem to never end. And you kind of get not used to it, but a little normalized to it. And it's not for everyone, because the anger can burn you up and burn you out if you don't have, spiritual traditions and elders to keep you calm. And I've seen many activists during protests just start to get so enraged, and the elders take them aside and, minister to them and calm them down and wipe them down with eagle feathers and cleanse them and restore that balance. Because, as the Haudenosaunee says, we need to think with a good mind, and to think with a good mind is practicing gratitude. So, again, being grateful for even those people who make you so angry, that we can see new things and we can learn new things about how to dismantle that racism or that oppression that is making us so angry. So it's a dance. It's not an easy one. And I still get very angry and very sad, by the devastation that's happening in the world today. And sometimes tears come, the rains come with that sadness for all the beautiful people that are suffering, or the beautiful animals that have been driven to extinction or on the verge of it, and then the injustices. So there's a reason and a time to be angry and to be sad, but we don't want that to overwhelm us and prevent us from being positive change agents. Yeah. So that's maybe, retreat and taking time out for yourself and your family, and always practicing gratitude, I think, is really a great way to get on the other side of it.
Very good. Thank you. Yeah. Now I'm going to squeeze one of my questions in. You used the term survivance. And I wonder if you could speak to it and the difference between survivance and mere survival.
Yes. So one of my great teachers has been the Ojibwe intellectual scholar Gerald Visner. And Visner is famous for his neologisms. What is that word? I have a hard time with making up new words. But I learned from you, David, recently, I think it was you in your comments on my paper, that it's been around before. But I learned the word survivance from Gerald Visner. He has a book titled by that. And survivance is not mere survival, right? Survival has this connotation of just barely like hanging on by your fingernails, right? And he talks about survivance as being survival, but it's resistance to colonization. It also has endurance in there. So, it's like we are going to endure, and we're going to actually even thrive, and resilience is in there. We are incredibly resilient people. Visner is always talking about trickster mobility and trickster consciousness, and this ability to kind of counter and speak back to the colonizer with humor and reversals and comedy. And so survivance is not just eking out a living and barely hanging on. It's about, resistance. It's about endurance, and it's about thriving and resilience despite all of the horrific oppressions that have been faced on our people, or placed on our people. So survivance is a very important term of self-determination of modern contemporary Indigenous peoples who have been changed forever by colonization, and yet we are still here. We are still Indigenous. We are modern, and we are surviving. We are in survivance. Yeah.
Wonderful. Yeah. I mean, people talk today about the resurgence and revitalization of Indigenous communities. Have you reflected on what's been behind it? What's different? I mean, I can tell you, we were in a workshop together, and I said that, I went through the University of Toronto for my bachelor's and master's, McGill for my doctorate, two of the best universities in Canada, save for the University of Waterloo, which I have to say because I work here. But, I mean, Indigenous people were completely invisible throughout my education, even in courses of history of Canada, history of the United States. They were, the first few chapters of a history book mentioned them, and then they disappeared. The modern Indigenous person, the inconvenient Indian,
the inconvenient Indian, yes,
just disappeared from all discourse, except as the butt of racist jokes by our student newspaper from time to time. I mean, what's really changed? Because it has really dramatically.
It has really changed. I agree. I think, as I said, my mom's generation growing up in the 40s and 50s, coming of age. I mean, you passed as white, or you said you were French Canadian, or you said you were Mexican, or you said you were Portuguese, or you said you were something, whatever else you had to say to quote for your survivance. But I think it was after the 60s, certainly the civil rights movement had a big part to do with it. I think the ecological movement, the environmental movement had a big part to do with it, with the first Earth Day in, 1970, roughly, the 70s. But I really think it was a whole generation also of Indigenous peoples who went and got educated, became lawyers, and became, really became historians, and, became intellectuals. They were already intellectuals, but they just got the Western degree to, quote, prove it. I think of some of my teachers like Leroy Littlebear or Sakej Henderson, who speak native languages, have their own traditional traditions, and have law degrees from Harvard and from Stanford. And, so they speak both languages. And I think that's inspired a lot of Native people to be like, hey, we can reinvent the enemy's language. We can, go into Western education without being brutalized by it like residential and boarding schools, but we can use the tools of it and stay true to our original instructions and move forward. So I think that big part of it has been the asserting the leadership, Indigenous leadership. I think the protest movements and the occupations have something to do with it. Certainly recently with Standing Rock in North Dakota, with the Water Protectors movement, 2016 was huge. And there's been key movements, the 1969 Alcatraz occupation of the American Indian movement here in San Francisco. But I think in the last 10, 20 years, I think settler communities, there's been some awakening or some recognition, and it's the younger generations of the original settlers, quote, pioneers that were the, racist, and that still exists. But I think the younger generations are like, wait a minute, why were they racist to these people? Wait, how did I inherit this farm? How did my grandparents get this farm? Oh, they killed some Indians, or, and they burned them down, or they, wait a minute, is this just for me to inherit property and money that was made by the genocide and enslavement of other peoples? So I think there is really, I would say, the prophecy of the seventh fire of the Anishinaabe, lighting the eighth fire. I think that it's young people and young settler and mixed race people who, have this recognition that Indigenous peoples have been very much oppressed and yet have such profound wisdom traditions and knowledge traditions. And need some rights recognized again. I think the passing of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples in 2007, as contested and troublesome as it is with our various nation states with signing on to it, I think all of that's contributed to revitalization, resurgence, survivance in the last couple of decades. Because when I studied ecology and indigenous studies 30 years ago, people thought I was crazy. They were like, what does science and indigenous studies and religion have to do with each other? Like, you know, you're crazy. People just thought I was crazy. And now, you know, so many people and programs and departments and everyone's like putting it together. So I'm just happy I got to see this day. And we still have a lot of work to do. No one's let off the hook. We have a lot of work to do. But it's moving finally in the right direction. Yeah.
That's, I mean, we're nowhere near where we want to be, but thank goodness we're not where we were.
Right. And Canada is one step ahead of the US, that you have a national dialogue about reconciliation. Just that you have it explicitly out there. We still don't have that. It's still a dirty little secret in the US.
Okay, I think we have come to the end of our time for a question period, and it's time for me to thank you. I haven't mentioned that to our attendees. Perhaps they've gotten on to the fact that we've done a workshop together and we're working on an edited volume. This is centered at the University of Victoria, the Centre for Religion and Society, and there we are working on a edited volume called Indigenous Indigenous Spiritualities in Canada: Opening and Closing Relations, and the editors are John Burrows, Heidi Kipwasinik-Stark, Paul Branadat, and myself. And regular attenders of our center will know that all of those people, and now Melissa, have given talks at the St. Jerome Center. So I feel that we kind of are welcoming you home.
I'm honored. I'm
honored. Anyway, Melissa, thank you for this. I think just such an interesting, original, and important perspective on land, which we all too often think about in terms of real estate or crown land or nature, the environment, that thing that isn't part of us. And you talked about how the land is part of us, and we are part of the land, that intimate relationship. So I thought that insight that there can be no reconciliation among peoples without reconciliation to the land was really a highlight of your talk for me. I mean, it really requires a radically different relationship of humans to the land and the non-human world, and it depends upon radically different relations among people and peoples, especially a new relationship between non-Indigenous Canadians and Indigenous peoples in Canada. So you have given us much light this evening, despite the many challenges that you have addressed and outlined so well. I found your talk to be remarkably hopeful. In fact, even talking about anger, I found you almost annoyingly cheerful. Okay. I thought, can this woman stay angry?
Yeah,
I would say not cheerful, but hopeful. Hopeful was the tone of the evening. I mean, too often we feel the challenges of climate change and reconciliation, environmental justice are so great that nothing can be done. And you've offered us example after example of how Indigenous communities have courageously begun to take action, actions rooted in their specific culture and guided by their particular spiritual genius. So thank you so much for an enlightening talk. And I know the attendees agree with me, because as I said, the questions that I was scrolling through the questions here, and I had to pass by quite a few just comments of what a terrific lecture and a terrific evening people were having. So thank you. And you'll just have to accept that people are in their homes applauding right now,
Oh,
because
well,
this
so-
online environment doesn't really allow us that.
Well, thank you all. My honor and my pleasure to share some words with you tonight. And I'm glad it was well received, and look forward to future dialogues and conversations through your lecture series and through our book project when it gets published.
Hopefully we'll have you in person.
I would love that. Yeah, we'll do that in the future.
Usually at this time I announce the next lecture. But the current fog of uncertainty around COVID-19 has shaped the way we are offering the lectures this year, one semester at a time, since we don't know. I mean, officially the University of Waterloo has said we will have in-person instruction for students, but for public events, that is still up in the air. And so the what we'll probably do is have a couple more online lectures to see where the numbers are going. We thought the numbers are going down, and now they're going up, and oh my goodness. So talk about a fog. Hopefully we will be able to meet on our beloved campus, and we will be able to meet in person. So we will, if you want to know about the upcoming lectures, please register your email with the Lectures in Catholic Experience, and we will send that information along. Finally, all I have to do now is to thank the people who have helped put the evening together. Morgan Regier, who is our producer, and Marilyn Caird, who basically runs the center after I mess things up. She sets them straight. Tate Kelly, who is our IT support person. And again, Melissa, thank you for your talk. And finally, I want to thank our audience for joining us and supporting us, and we will be in touch with you with regards to the winter lineup, which is promising to look very, very good indeed. So good night, everyone.